Okay, welcome back to part 3 of East Asia. We're going to go ahead and talk about geopolitics and then the economic and social aspects of this region. I will be honest with you, this is probably, it's a rough section to cover. There is a lot of information. These are countries that our own country deals with quite a lot politically, economically as well. Socially, especially here from a Hawaiian perspective, from the state of Hawaii, right? This is, I think there's so much to cover in this chapter. We could honestly have an entire course just on geopolitics of one of these regions. So I'm really just going to kind of go over a lot of the information, just kind of quickly and give you a brief overview. There is a lot. I think even reading this chapter, it feels like there's a lot to process. There's a lot to try and kind of remember. I don't want you to stress about this section too much. With that said, so geopolitics. There are a couple of things that we have talked a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit more. One of the things that, and a lot of this stuff really, I'm hoping at least, if you are familiar, if you read news, at least news headlines at all, then a lot of this stuff should be really kind of, most people, if I say Rocket Man, for example, you should know that I'm talking about Donald Trump's reference to the leader of North Korea. I say leader specifically, not president. One thing on here that I would like to talk about, but we just really don't have the time, is we've got disputed islands. You can see there's several disputed islands. Some of these are between, for example, Japan and China, Russia and Japan, and then these islands down here. I think we actually might talk about this when we get to Southeast Asia. The Spratly Islands. Actually, I'm pretty sure we talk about this when we get to Southeast Asia. Sorry. Which way did I go? Oh, I went really far. Okay. I just went the wrong way. So I'm pretty sure we do talk about this as Southeast Asia, but if not, I highly recommend too, just kind of Googling. New York Times has a really cool article about the Spratly Islands, but I'm pretty sure we actually talk about it when we get to Southeast Asia. Okay, so there's a lot in this video. There's a lot going on, and I think, honestly, this is an online format, but I think that a lot of times the students can get more benefit from watching some of these particular videos, YouTube videos, a bit more than just getting information from me and just reading. These give us a bit more background information. Taiwan situation, I'll briefly talk about Taiwan, the Great Leap Forward, which was basically this kind of plans for development that largely failed and led to the death of millions of Chinese people in the last century, but it's a huge part of the development plan. There's a quick crash course, which I like sometimes don't. But I think one, and then the last two, I'd really like you to watch. How powerful is China, and how much of the U.S. does China own? Because our relationship with China is something that you guys will be inheriting. And I think, that's a major, this course, it is important to learn about what's going on in the world, learn about other countries. But I think, what I'd really like my students to take away from this course is you guys are the next generation. You guys are our voters. You guys have a lot of power to help guide the future of our country. And I don't think, we are living in a country. I think back at Brexit, for example, which was the exit of Great Britain from the UK, and the most of the people who voted for the Brexit, I believe, were like 50 or 60 and above. Most of the MPs, the basically like your senators, were again over the age of like 50 or 60. And a lot of young people were furious because just recently they came back with the bill. So the cost of what they're going to have to pay the EU, and they're going to be having to pay this for like the next 50 some years, but it comes out to billions and billions of dollars. So this is basically people our age, in their 20s and 30s, are going to be paying for this bill for the rest of their life through taxes. And they're paying this based on a decision that people who are probably going to be dead in 10 to 20 years made. And this is ultimately what we're seeing today. And that's why I think it's so important that younger people, again, if you ask most people, even people in their 20s and 30s, do you like politics? Most people they have this like filthy hatred for politics. They don't want to know anything about politics. Politics is not as complicated as it has to be. A lot of what we look at in here, understanding geopolitics, is highly associated to this. Understanding what's going on in the world, why it's going on, is very empowering because it can help you guys make decisions. And you guys, whether or not you're aspiring to be a local representative of our government or a national or state representative, these are problems that you guys will be inheriting. These are problems that my generation is inheriting as well. So I do think it's really important to understand what's going on within the world. And this region is particularly important, and even more so for our specific place in the world here in Hawaii. So again, I'm just going to kind of do a quick crash course and talk about a bunch of these things. There's basically, one of the things I want you to take away from China and the history of China, the book goes on quite a bit, but China has not always just been China. There have been multiple dynasties, multiple different ruling groups and different ethnic groups that have ruled. Manchurian dynasty, for example, or the Qing dynasty ruled for quite a while. And then they saw the fall of their dynasty. In many ways, it was like a colonization. And then it fell to a new group. And China has a long history of this. So while we do think today as China being one of the longest or the oldest quote unquote civilizations or countries, it actually has a long history of changing power and changing hands. What we would refer to as the modern era, your book is talking about the last 150, 200 years, where it's been more open to outside influence. The Opium Wars are basically, it was the UK or the Great Britain at the time was forcing, China was willingly trading, but Great Britain wasn't satisfied with basically the cost of trade. So they started selling opium. Get the people addicted to drugs. People are willing to do most things for drugs. And there was actually 2 opium wars, they call them opium wars, over this dispute because obviously the Chinese government, the ruling power at the time wasn't happy that they started selling drugs to people. Kind of sounds like modern day politics, right? I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of this, but I just kind of want you to see. So this, first of all, we can see imperialism in East Asia. So we've got the different, and these are spheres of influence. Remember, imperialism is not necessarily colonialism. Colonialism is a form of imperialism. But imperialism is different. So it's influence and control, but not through direct control, not through direct invasion. So you can see we've got a German sphere of influence, a French sphere of influence. There are French colonial possessions, which those are not in this specific region that we're talking about, but in Southeast Asia. You can see Russian sphere of influence, Russian territory, British sphere of influence, British colonial possessions, so basically some parts of Southeast Asia and then South Asia as well. So you can see that there is a long-standing history of influence, but particularly in the region we're talking about, it's not so much colonization. So we don't see the same aspects as we see in a lot of the other regions we've talked about. Largely speaking, these countries have remained independent more or less throughout history. So some post-war geopolitics for Korea. Korea basically was its own country. At the end of World War II, you had Russia and China were supporting communism, and the U.S. was supporting democracy. So basically, they decided to just split the country in half and say at the 38th parallel, okay, you guys stay to the north, we'll stay to the south. And then it was when the communist north invaded the south in the 50s, that's when we got involved in the Korean War. And that's where we still have two separate nations today of North Korea and South Korea. I meant to talk about that later on. So Korea, and I'll get back to this when we get to the economic development and the economic and social aspects. North Korea, obviously, is still very closed off to the world, but South Korea is quite distinct, where South Korea has went from a very poor country to actually being a major global player in the global market for a lot of different products. So China, we see this, not going to go into this too much. We talked about Central Asia, these different divisions, Chinese territorial domain with Xinjiang and Tibet in particular. Mongolia has a history with China as well. China has been historically divided and reunified and divided. It's got, again, we're talking about thousands of years of history. So it has gone through multiple periods of division and reunification. If you go back and watch the first videos that we talked about, or if you already watched them, then it talks a little bit more about the communist invasion of China, and I'll get to this in a couple slides as well when we talk about Taiwan. So economic and social indicators, you can see again we have Hong Kong on the list. So GNI, remember GNI is the gross national income, so it's all of the money that a country makes and produces based on goods, but it's also based on remittances and money that could be brought in from abroad. So you can see this is basically it's divided on a population level. So this is more or less, you can kind of think about what a household makes, more or less. So you can see Hong Kong is definitely the wealthiest, quote unquote, nation in this list. Japan is next, followed by Taiwan is up there as well. North Korea is disproportionately much lower. China, again, when you take in the reality of China being very economically like income distribution, it's very uneven throughout the country. This is why China is so much lower. So GDP, average annual percent of growth from 2000 to 2010. North Korea obviously is not included on here. China, it's not surprising. China has had one of the fastest growing economies. Human Development Index. So Taiwan and North Korea, there's no data. China is quite a bit lower than the rest of the countries in the region. In many ways, I'm actually kind of surprised it's as high as it is. Percent of the population living below $2 a day. Again, the lines basically mean that we don't have any data available. I would imagine North Korea is quite high. Not so much for the other regions. We see China, it's almost 30% of the population, so that's actually quite a bit. Life expectancy, not too bad across the board. North Korea and China are definitely on the lower end. Under age 5 mortality rate. So North Korea and China are both quite high. This was 1990. I always forget that. So you can see huge improvements between 1990 and 2010. But you look at China, for example, has made quite considerable differences, but North Korea not quite as much. It's minimally improved. Adult literacy, I'd actually be interested to see if it really is 100% for North Korea. And again, a lot of the countries just don't have data available. And then gender inequality index. I would actually, again, be kind of surprised that gender equality is this high. So remember, the lower the number, the greater the equality, and the higher the number, the greater inequality. So there's a lot of data available, and I would actually question whether or not a lot of these numbers are actually very realistic. So Japan's economy has had, again, Japan was very closed off to the rest of the world. Remember, we talked about until basically U.S. warships showed up and said, we're trading with you. Do you have a problem with that? So they eventually got their economy to work quite well for them. They had a huge economic boom, followed by a bust, and then they've had, again, quite a good boom. So they have a long history of booms and busts. I mean, you could say quite comparative to many countries, but I think their economy has been much more characterized by these clear booms and busts. But their economy is actually doing very, very well. It's one of the strongest economies in the world. There is a high cost of living, partially due to the fact that it's an island and a lot has to be imported, partially just due to where it happens to be and the quality of life that's there as well. There's pretty low unemployment, and they have a really good system of government health care, so it is definitely a country that takes care of its people. Marriage and fertility rates have continually been in the decline, and now this is a problem we call a grain of the core. So a lot of Japanese families only have one child, and those children now have only had one child, or many are opting not to have children as well, not to have marriage, which obviously marriage and fertility rates in decline. And this grain of the core, kind of, you might have heard something about like the baby boomers getting older, and the baby boomers, we have this grain of, when we say grain of the core, we're talking about all core nations, but this grain of our economy. So we have a lot of people retiring, a lot of people who are going to need medical expenses, social security expenses, a lot of people who are going to need different services, but we have less people working, and therefore we have a reduced tax base. So you have less people working or less people earning money, and you have less taxes coming into the government. And these are a lot of the issues that Japan is currently working towards to solve now, as well as continually into the future. Surprisingly, this is one country you actually don't hear a lot about propagandas to try and get people to have more kids. Although I would imagine that they would have quite good incentives, since they seem to have pretty good welfare social benefit systems. So some of the newer countries we've seen, these newly industrialized countries, I should say as well. So South Korea has done quite well for itself for the last several decades. They have quite a strong economy, and they've become definitely a much stronger global player than they had been after the Korean War. Taiwan has an interesting history. You just saw the video a couple minutes ago, so you know more about that history. I'm not going to go into that too much more. But to sum it up, again, this is a really great example of geopolitics. They were the Chinese ruling party fled, went to Taiwan. Taiwan was recognized as the Chinese government, the official Chinese government, by the United Nations, by the United States for several decades, until basically it became geopolitically in our interest, our best interest, to recognize all of a sudden mainland China rather than Taiwan. So Taiwan went from being recognized as the official government of China to literally one day to the next, oh, you're just an island, and we're not really going to get involved in whether or not you're an independent country or not, because we don't want to piss China off. Basically, that's what it's come down to. Hong Kong passed back from British rule to Chinese rule based on a treaty that was several decades old. And they've maintained, they were doing so well, basically as like this type of independent island nation territory. And for the most part, China has pretty much just laid off of Hong Kong. As long as they pay their taxes, as long as they don't cause any problems, China's not going to cause any problems for them. But again, this is a situation where outside countries have to be cautious about how they approach and how they discuss these topics, these countries, these islands. Chinese development. So I had you watch the video in the beginning that talked about communist development. There have been a lot of issues under communist development. And again, communism, like you're talking about, is an economic and a social system, which is not always necessarily enacted or played out in the way that it was theorized to do so. China, they've taken this interesting, and again, you would have seen a little bit in this videos, but they've taken this interesting perspective of going from communist to basically wanting nothing to do with capitalism to kind of learning to play the game, but according to their own rules. It's probably the best way I can phrase it for you. So it's arguable whether or not they're actually beating us at our own game. And as you hear about trade wars and imposing tariffs. This will be interesting to see. It's a huge, it's a geopolitical situation where we're seeing how this struggle for power and hegemonic influence on an international level is being played out, right? So it's very interesting to see, and it'll continue to be interesting to see what role China continues to play in the world. But definitely, it's not something to just be brushed aside and said, it's not important. They are definitely changing the rules to the world economic game. And then your book talks about these special economic zones, which basically was a way to get businesses, foreign companies in and manufacturing, similar to what we've done with like Mexico and some Caribbean nations as well. This said, and China does have a quickly growing economy. We saw that their GDP is increasing drastically from one year to the next, but regardless, there's still huge disparities in economic well-being of their citizens. So you can see this is GDP per capita. So this was in 2011. The dark purple are basically, you kind of think of this as people earning over $10,000 a year. That's kind of what it translates to. So basically, we've got the one region up north, which is Tianjin and Beijing, and Shanghai. So these are the three. Remember we talked about, I said there were cities and they're technically like special provinces. So those are the three. And remember, you can't just go and move to these cities. You need to have permission. And then it looks like actually Hong Kong is right there as well. This is Taiwan, so you're aware. Hong Kong is taking this little island there. Hainan and Macau is this little tiny island is there as well. So then the next ones are between 7,500 and 10,000. You could say again like a year. So these darker purples, lighter purples are 5,000 to 7,500, or just $1 less. And then these regions, the lighter purple is basically 2,500 to 5,000. So disproportionately earning a quarter, or basically 25% of what they earn in the cities. Of course, there's also going to be a cost of difference, or difference in the cost of living expenses as well, but you can still see that there's a huge disparity between one side of the country, one region of the country, and another. So I just want to briefly talk about, most people are aware that China had a one-child policy. They no longer have a one-child policy, and it wasn't quite universal as well. A lot of people, or a lot of like rural regions, were allowed to have still 2 children. If you did have 2 children, there usually was, and you weren't allowed to, you were supposed to pay like additional taxes and fines, which a lot of people couldn't afford. There's a lot of really interesting documentaries on the one-child policy. Some of them are available on Netflix, YouTube. If you're interested, I highly recommend checking it out. Fertility has varied, and again, this is something that we could talk a lot about, and I'd really love to have more time to go into this. So there was female infanticide. So basically, and like we'll talk about with India as well, basically abortions are illegal, but so are, cannot think of the English word, sonograms. So sonograms, at least to the extent I know of using them to find out the sex of the baby, is technically not allowed. And I don't know if it's allowed now or not, because a lot of people were, so you have 2 things. People are aborting the babies, or people are killing the babies, the females, as soon as they're born. So there's a huge disproportionate numbers between males and females that exist, to the extent that a lot of, you hear of women being kidnapped from countrysides and then taken far away from their homes and forced to marry a man in a city or another province. And this has led to this, we call a growing gender imbalance. And realistically speaking, the position of women, and that's why I question the statistic regarding gender equality, because the position of women in the country is much lower and much worse than that of men. There's still, I read articles every once in a while that there's still like these reforming schools or behavior schools for women, and you can send your girlfriend, wife, daughter, mother, sister, I don't know who, but you can send them to these reforming schools, and they will basically teach them to be subservient and submissive females, and do what the men in their lives say. Okay, so that is the end. Here's your quick summary. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.